Thank you. The next item of business is a Labour Party debate on motion 19939 in the name of Richard Leonard on universal credit. Can I ask those members who wish to take part in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? I call on Richard Leonard to speak to and move the motion. 6 minutes, Mr Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Later this afternoon, this Parliament has an opportunity to unite in calling for the scrapping of the universal credit system. It is a system that has delivered so much misery and so much hardship, even destitution, to so many people across Scotland and the UK. So much so that it has been described as, and I quote, a digital and sanitised version of the 19th century workhouse. That's the damning indictment by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston. So I hope that this afternoon, this Parliament will seize the opportunity to unite, to call for its immediate termination, although I fear that it will not. My appeal to members of this Parliament, on all sides, is do not willfully ignore the evidence in front of us. In community after community across Scotland, from the welfare advisors I listened to in Wick, who said that, and I quote, universal credit was an unmitigated disaster, to the people of Balmulloch in Glasgow, who told me of the impact on the human spirit of grinding poverty and this most extreme material deprivation caused by universal credit. They know, and members of this Parliament ought to know, that universal credit has been a central part of the failed austerity experiment. It is an experiment where if you are on job seekers allowance, you can be sanctioned for attending job interviews. If you are looking for work and on Christmas Day you do not check for vacancies, you can be sanctioned. And look no further than the case of somebody chronically anxious and depressed who has been repeatedly sanctioned for not updating their online journal, a case which has been brought to our attention for this debate by Citizens Advice Scotland, who say, and I quote, he has no computer skills or access to the internet at home. He has no money at all and is reliant on crisis grants and food parcels. The distress is exacerbating his poor mental health, and his overall quality of life is deteriorating, hindering his ability to find work. So it is a vicious downward spiral that should shame us all. Our social security system, which was conceived to provide a helping hand to people when they need it, from the cradle to the grave, has become so disfigured in the hands of the Tory government, and let us not forget the role of the Liberal Democrats in this, that instead of being a means of driving poverty down, it has become a vehicle for driving poverty up. So instead of it being part of the solution, it itself has become part of the problem. And what's worse, with the two-child cap, those families in deepest poverty, those children in deepest poverty, are the ones who are penalised the most. And so that today, as many as 12,000 of Scotland's poorest families are hurt by this measure alone. And then we come to the moral outrage of the rape clause which accompanies it, which violates the privacy and the dignity, and I would argue the human rights of women expected to complete the form NCC 106/19. Then there is the benefits cap regime, which has had the effect of increased evictions, a rise in the use of food banks, and a deleterious effect on health, both physical and mental health. And we know that the universal credit system deliberately, quite deliberately, pushes people into debt by legislating for a minimum 5-week delay in payment. This is not by accident, it is by design. Yes?
Fulton McGregor.
Sorry. I thank Richard Leonard for taking intervention. There's very little there I would disagree with him, but does he agree with me and people on these benches that we should be asking for all these, we should be demanding actually all these powers are in the hands of this Parliament, regardless of views on independence?
Richard Leonard.
Yeah. The problem with Mr McGregor's argument is that SNP ministers asked the DWP to delay the devolution of benefits twice in 2016 and 2018. In February of this year, Scottish ministers revealed that full devolution of benefits would only be completed in 2024. And then again in June, you changed it even further in advance to 2025, so you can't be trusted to take on the powers when you're given the powers. No wonder that housing associations report that 73% of tenants on universal credit are in arrears, which is why Jeremy Corbyn and I together backed the Living Rents No Evictions campaign in Edinburgh last week. Of course there will be those who say in this debate, give us our separate Scottish state and we'll do it better. But they must read their own Growth Commission report, which talks about the billions that will need to be taken out of the system to pay for the creation of a separate Scottish currency, to make up for the Jers gap and to offset the loss of the Barnett formula. The Labour Party is clear. We recognise that universal credit is cruel, it is punitive, it is immoral. So we will end the benefit cap, the two-child limit, and we will do it with immediate effect. We will kick out once and for all private firms like Atos, because in the end, this debate is a choice. Do we act or do we walk on by? Do we start now immediately to right a wrong, or do we wait another decade or even longer? In Labour, we believe that the time has come to act decisively. So let's scrap universal credit. Let us put it in its place. Let's put in its place a helping hand, which is based on the dignity of all and our shared sense of humanity. Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Shirley Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to move Amendment 19939.3. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Universal credit is failing the people of Scotland and it's failing the people of the UK. It causes hardship, debt and a need for emergency aid. That evidence is indisputable. We have repeatedly called on the UK Government to halt the rollout and the migration of people onto universal credit and to get those problems fixed. The original aim of universal credit, to simplify the system and to create a single source of support that adapts as circumstances change, they were right, they were reasonable. But the flaws in both the design and the delivery, coupled with the benefit cuts imposed by the UK Government, have made it utterly unworkable. It is those many flaws that we need to scrap, and it is the Tories' determination to use the excuse of austerity to punish the poorest in our society that needs to end. Now, I understand Labour's call to scrap universal credit, but at this point I am still unsure what they propose to replace it with. And I haven't heard any more detail of that today. Are they planning a new benefit? If they are planning a new benefit, would it be introduced after universal credit is fully rolled out? Will the fixes to universal credit be made at the same time as a new system is being introduced? How long would it take for that new benefit to be designed, to be introduced, to be fully rolled out? We simply do not know. Certainly.
Neil Findlay.
Minister tell us if it's her position that she wants to keep universal credit, given that it's completely and utterly discredited.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm very pleased to support the Labour motion tonight to support the scrapping of universal credits. And I'll go through some of the details of the changes, the radically different benefit I would like to see. I'm not quite sure still, with the greatest respect, what Labour want. Do they want a new benefit? Do they want adaptations or not? And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has warned against the dangers of scrapping universal credit wholesale, saying that it leaves two systems, both with problems, uncertainty and increased complexity. Better to put all efforts into improving it. So does universal credit in its current form need to be scrapped? For the benefit of Neil Findlay, absolutely yes. It can be replaced by a version that works to support people and is a safety net that it should be. Now, an uncaring, callous UK Government with a revolving door of DWP ministers have had their heads in the sand over the clear flaws of this benefit. The ridiculous 5-week wait for the first payment. That needs to be drastically reduced, and payments, not loans, must be provided at the beginning of a claim, so there is no longer a wait in getting that much-needed financial support. The UK Government should also follow our lead and give the whole of the UK a choice of twice monthly payments and direct payments to landlords, as we do through Scottish Choices. Its success is clear, with almost 50% of people offered taking up one or both of those choices. And an immediate step that could be taken, and quite rightly pointed out by Richard Leonard, should be taken, is to scrap that two-child limit, which has affected over 9,000 families in Scotland already. And of course, as he points out, that abhorrent rape clause, a policy still defended by the Tories in this Parliament, and I wonder whether they will have the courage of their own convictions to do so to that today. I admit to that support. Just like lifting the benefit cap, reversing the benefit freeze and scrapping the bedroom tax, these are all immediate steps that should be taken to support people who have been hurt by years of UK welfare cuts. We have years of evidence of what needs to be fixed. We must prioritise making those changes to deliver a radically different benefit. Now, the Scottish Government is using its limited powers to make the lives of people in Scotland better, and like the UK Government, our system does not have and will never have a cap on the number of eligible children in a family who can receive support through our new benefits. We have introduced a raft of new benefits and announced the new Scottish child payment, something which I'm not entirely sure Richard Leonard agrees with the timetable of, given he's just criticised the changes that we've made for our devolution setup to ensure that we can allow that to happen by Christmas next year. And that's deeply concerning that we can't get support from that from the Labour Party. But this is a matter of political choice. The UK Government chooses to introduce universal credit with a myriad of complexities and its cuts. The Scottish Government chooses to introduce child poverty targets in legislation and implement that £10 a week game-changing new benefit to tackle child poverty head-on. But this does show, Presiding Officer, why social security should be in Scotland's hands, not just a partial devolution of powers, but all powers, because only independence can ensure that we don't have policies imposed upon us. We can choose our own path. We can bring fairness, dignity and respect to all of social security and deliver a system that works for everyone.
Please move the amendment.
I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I now call Michelle Ballantyne to speak to and move Amendment 19939.2. Ms Ballantyne, 4 minutes. There's a little time in hand for interventions. That's why members are giving a little bit extra if they take an intervention. Ms Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2010, when universal credit was first announced, it received a cross-party welcome. Indeed, Dr Ellie Whiteford of the SNP's Westminster Social Justice spokesperson at the time said some of the measures set out today, particularly the universal credit, are very welcome. The Labour Party expressed cautious support for the principles of universal credit, an easier and more efficient social security system that offered one single payment and both incentivised and rewarded paid employment opportunities. And why, Presiding Officer? Because every political party recognised that the erstwhile system of legacy benefits was not working and that the system was in desperate need of fundamental reform, and to pretend otherwise is fallacious. During its time in power, Labour did have ample opportunity to reform welfare in the United Kingdom, but they chose not to. Instead, they left a system that was in chaos, a system that was far too complex for its own good, where each benefit had their own rules and methods, a system that paid out without due diligence, resulting in fraudulent claims, and worst of all, a system that acted as a barrier for people wanting to get into work. Labour's motion today makes no reference to how they would change the welfare system. There is no reference to what would replace universal credit, nor is there a reference to how Labour would improve people's lives by encouraging them back into work and increasing their employment and earning opportunities. Labour have never offered any practical options. Instead, they continue to dangle the possibility of a discredited universal basic income policy, a policy that proved to be unsustainable when trialled in Canada and Finland. Presiding Officer, I believe that this debate is a perfect opportunity to set some of the records straight and recognise that, yes, universal credit has had its issues, but it is the best way forward for welfare in this country. It is right that the rollout of universal credit is done sensitively, as this allows for any issues to be explored and addressed, and that is why time is being taken to roll it out to those who are not new claimants. The evidence is clear that universal credit is working for the vast majority of claimants. The claimant experience survey of 2018, published in January, revealed a satisfaction rate of 84% for the DWP and its services. 94% of all claims and 84% of new claims were paid on time. While universal credit works for the majority, it is really important that we recognise and support those who have not had a satisfactory experience. And we will never ignore the 16% of claimants who say they have not had a good experience. And you can see in the design of universal credit that that is exactly what has happened. Universal credit has the flexibility to learn and change, and many adaptations and changes have been made from the feedback that has been given by people who have not had good experiences. But the opposition do seem to keep ignoring some of the positives. There is £2.4 billion of benefits that are unclaimed, and we're currently in the committee actually looking at why people don't claim the benefits they're entitled to. And there are a number of reasons. There is stigma and there is fear. And the commentary that comes out from many of the parties does nothing to help that. It is estimated that around 700,000 more people will be paid their full entitlement because of the systems under universal credit. That is a positive improvement, and it would behold the opposition parties in this chamber to actually acknowledge some of these things.
The member is just concluding. She's almost finished.
The fact of the matter is that there is an increase in employment under universal credit. We have the lowest unemployment levels now for 45 years and the lowest number of people in low-paid jobs. And we are welcoming some number of changes this year that I think will move towards helping people and addressing some of the issues.
And you must just simply move your amendment, please. I'm sorry.
Okay.
You didn't take interventions. I can't give you extra time.
I will move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call Alison Johnson, please. Ms Johnson, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the 3.5 years since this Parliament was last elected, we've debated motions on universal credit 5 times. Today's the 6th. Universal credit was mooted by the Centre for Social Justice 10 years ago and legislated for over 7 years ago, yet we're still debating a system that is causing untold misery to tens of thousands of our constituents. So that says something about how little has changed. And in my short time today, I'd like to focus particularly on the impact of the benefit freeze on universal credit and also the losses people experience when moving into the new system. Certainly.
Ruth Maguire.
I appreciate you taking the intervention. I wonder if you would just, if you would agree with me that none of us are saying that the principle of simplifying benefits is wrong. What we simply recognise, because we step out of our offices and speak to people that live in our constituencies, is the pain, the real pain and suffering that it causes on the ground for the people that have to actually navigate this ridiculous system.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Ruth Maguire's comments. So the benefits freeze is scheduled to end in April next year, but the damage has already been done. The 1.7% increase announced won't do anything at all to replace the income people have lost over the last 4 years. That amounts to around 6% of lost income. According to the House of Commons Library, for universal credit, that's between £888 and £1,845 lower in real terms than without the freeze. Comparing benefit incomes to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation minimum income standard reveals how inadequate the benefit system has become. The minimum income standards based on surveys that ask people what they think the minimum acceptable standard of living should be. Not a life of luxury, just a basic standard. And in 2018, an unemployed couple would only receive income sufficient to get them to 32% of that minimum income standard. For a lone parent with 2 children, it's just 60%. These figures have been falling for years, but they've fallen even faster since the start of the benefit freeze. And it's not surprising then that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation argues that the freeze will increase poverty more than any other policy. Now, the motion rightly mentions the benefit cap, one of the most insidious of recent reforms. It perverts the needs-based nature of the system by assessing people as requiring a certain amount of support and then reducing it by an entirely arbitrary amount. This laser targets women and children as it impacts mainly single-parent households. As part of the Social Security Committee's investigation into housing support, I met women from Leith in Edinburgh they'd been made homeless by the benefit cap. They were no longer able to afford their rent, and they were trying to bring up children in hotel and B&B accommodation. If anyone thinks that this is a good use of cash, you know, they're so misguided. I mean, on top of the benefit freeze and the benefit cap, universal credit entitlement is simply less for some people than the previous system. The respected Institute for Fiscal Studies shows that under universal credit, around 1.9 million people have entitlements that are less than in the older system by at least £1,000 a year. For many people, universal credit has been a cover for cuts, the reductions being masked in the move to the new system. The motion and the government amendment, both of which Greens will support, are right to call for the scrapping of a whole number of changes, but even then we're still not addressing the fact that in many cases the social security system no longer provides an adequate standard of living. The system has been chipped away at so consistently for so long that even before the two-child limit, the freeze, the benefit cap and universal credit, the system wasn't always adequately supporting those who needed it. We need to have a conversation about what kind of society we want to live in, what level of support we should be offering. If we're to call ourselves a compassionate country, both reserved and devolved social security should reflect that. I'd like to close, Presiding Officer, by reflecting on a committee exchange I had with the former Secretary of State, Esther McVey, regarding the rape clause. I asked her whether she was comfortable with asking women to provide that they'd been raped in order to get support for their child. All she had to say was that the woman concerned would get double support. I failed to see how asking women who've been through one of the most awful experiences anyone can imagine to prove that is doing anything like supporting them. Any member who votes against the motion today are saying that they're comfortable with this, and I'd invite them to reflect on that when we reach decision time. Thank you.
Now call Liam MacArthur. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Universal credit isn't working. I think evidence demands acceptance of this across the political spectrum. If food parcels are being distributed in their thousands, the system isn't working. If people are being forced into a cycle of arrears, the system isn't working. And if hundreds of thousands of people need help to complete applications online, the system isn't working. And if food bank usage increases by 23%, the system isn't working. It should be a safety net when needed, as well as a catalyst to helping people into work where appropriate. In order to achieve those aims, reform of the legacy system was necessary. And the premise of universal credit is one that Liberal Democrats supported, and we believe that a streamlined system, one that is joined up and accessible, is in the interests of those relying on it. Many poverty campaigners agreed with the underlying principles, but as it stands, universal credit is now detached from the individuals it is there to help. A sensible premise, in effect, that has been thoroughly undermined. So reform is urgently needed. The two-child limit and the benefit cap must be removed. I will take an intervention from Neil Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
I hope Mr MacArthur he may have been coming to this, but will he take this opportunity to apologise for the behaviour of his party when in coalition with the Tories, when they cut benefits for disabled people, when they cut housing benefit for young people, when they made people poorer and gave tax cuts to the richest? Will he apologise for his party's behaviour?
Liam MacArthur.
I think what I will do is remind Neil Finlay that his party were also supportive of the introduction of universal credit. And in terms of tax changes made as a result of the Liberal Democrats in government, it was releasing the tax implications on some of the poorer people in our community. Almost 240,000 Scottish children are now officially recognised as living in poverty. Arbitrarily limiting the support that is available to vulnerable families means that number is only likely to increase. The benefit cap is equally counterproductive. Only 17% of people affected by the benefit cap are expected to be looking for work, and yet that is one of the stated aims of the policy. But scrapping the system altogether and starting again, when millions of people have now moved to a new system, is also impractical. It would see more money spent on yet more administration rather than on supporting people. Labour is already proposing to invest £2 billion less than Liberal Democrats. Using the basic concept of streamlining multiple benefits into one, we need to fix existing problems, serious problems, and construct a new system which provides dignity and respect. And on that basis, Labour's motion is flawed. Demanding a system be scrapped without a hint of what will be put in its place is irresponsible. And to make those calls in the context of a wholesale failure to address the economic catastrophe that is Brexit is more irresponsible still. Because above all, our security system needs urgent investment. But that becomes so much harder with any form of Brexit. Brexit undermines every part of our economy, threatens public services, including the NHS, and yet still Jeremy Corbyn wants to get Brexit done. The same applies to those who argue that the chance of universal credit, like Brexit, can be avoided by simply breaking up the UK. No, thank you. The First Minister's own Growth Commission accepts that separation would lead to a decade of unprecedented austerity. The £50 billion Remain bonus is only available if we keep Scotland in the UK and the UK in the EU. We need to get back to seriously debating the policies that genuinely make a chance of making people's lives better. Instead, the Labour Party's proposal to scrap universal credit is nothing more than a Corbynite soundbite, one that the Rowntree Foundation has made clear would lead to uncertainty, increased complexity and wasted resources. And on that basis, we will not be supporting the motion tonight.
We move to the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. Ian Gray, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. My constituency of East Lothian was the first local authority area in Scotland to fully implement universal credit in March 2016. Due to this, people in East Lothian have borne the full brunt of the shambolic rollout of the UC system, and the harsh reality of universal credit for many of those constituents has been a spiral of debt and cuts to their benefits. Many have been plunged into poverty, having to rely on family and friends, as well as organisations like Citizens Advice and local food banks. That is the reality of universal credit for the 5,500 people in East Lothian struggling on this iniquitous system. Last year, the East Lothian Food Bank handed out 2,331 emergency food parcels, helping to feed almost 5,000 people, of which over 1,800 were children, all referred to the food bank due to poverty. And what is more, within just 1 year of the introduction of universal credit, East Lothian Council had already seen a very significant rise in rent arrears, as had the local housing association, causing financial problems for the council and the association, but above all, threatening constituents with homelessness. And this is a situation that continues to worsen. It is clear that universal credit must now be scrapped.
Jeremy Balfour.
Grateful, Mr Gray. If that's the case, why have the Trust said this? Scrapping universal credit may result in further upheaval and should not happen. Why is an organisation like the Trust saying, let's not get rid of it?
Ian Gray.
Well, I think they're talking about the capacity for change, and let me come to that a little later on in my remarks. After all, what kind of social security system is it that no longer provides a safety net for those who need it, but rather drives people further and further into poverty? I tell you, it is a Tory social security system. That's what it is. Wrong in principle and wrong in practice. And that is why we must scrap universal credit and the government which created it. And yes, it is true that a new system would take time for change. The Cabinet Secretary made that point. But it is not true that Labour has not said how they would deal with this. Labour is committed to, on election, an emergency package of mitigation of universal credit, getting rid of the 5-week wait, scrapping the 2-child limit, scrapping the benefits cap, suspending sanctions and ending the digital-only approach. That is what a Labour government would do to universal credit, Cabinet Secretary. And as for the SNP's claims that the solution to this is the devolution of universal credit, the truth is, in the Smith Commission, Labour argued for much of universal credit to be devolved, but the Tories refused. The Lib Dems supported them. They were in coalition with them, of course, at the time. And the SNP were lukewarm, preferring the standalone benefits instead, which have indeed been devolved since. But no, but Labour did win the argument, that we should have the power to supplement reserve benefits, a critical power which the Scottish Government could use to end the rape clause in Scotland, just as we forced them to act on the bedroom tax. The truth is that the SNP record on devolved benefits is one of dither, delay, a lack of competence, no, and a failure of compassion. Right now, we have an opportunity to return a Labour government that will scrap universal credit in East Lothian and across the UK right away, once and for all. That is what my constituents need. They need it quickly. We must take this chance.
Maureen Watt, followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, members who were present during general questions last Thursday may recall I asked a question replied to by Minister Christina McKelvey on the Government's response to reports of women in Aberdeen, including single mothers, resorting to so-called survival sex because their universal credit payments do not cover the basic needs of daily living. The Minister said the whole thought of it made her, I quote, her blood run cold, and like me, was horrified by this situation. I would hope that all in this chamber are also horrified, although I'm not so sure, as one member of the Tory benches last week seemed to find it funny. It's important to note that it was the local police who highlighted this issue to Seafine, the biggest and most proactive food bank in the North East, and also which was asked by the government, by the way, to carry out the pilot in period poverty. The police recognised the problem of local women resorting to survival sex and wanted the women to get the help, which was not only providing them with food, but also to get the benefit checks and other help, which, as we know, food banks do provide as a wide range of services. It's well known that both poverty and social security are heavily gendered, as Close the Gap and other organisations which have sent us helpful briefings today fully recognise. They point out that women are twice as dependent on social security as men and therefore have been disproportionately affected by social security change and Westminster welfare reform, including the benefit cap and the two-child cap. This disproportionate effect is heaped upon the pre-existing inequality of the gender pay gap in Scotland, which is 13%, and women accounting for 2/3 of workers earning less than the living wage. This is most likely due to them having more caring responsibilities than men and having to find work which allows them to balance caring responsibilities with work. We also know that women with disabilities are amongst the hardest hit by welfare reform. On latest figures, 55% of those on PIP are women and 65% of those in receipt of attendance allowance are women. Shockingly also, the Women's Budget Group found that Asian families in the poorest fifth of UK households will see their living standards fall by over £11,600 per year on average from cuts to benefits and services. For black families, the real terms annual average loss will be over £8,400. Staggeringly, these reductions on already low incomes, and perhaps the Conservative members contributing today might tell us how folk are supposed to survive on these. Also, Presiding Officer, 48% of single parents' households are living in poverty and 92% of lone parents are women. Changes to child benefit, child tax credit, income support, maternity benefits and the benefit cap all have a significant impact on women with children. So, no wonder some women feel that they have to take desperate measures like engaging in survival sex. I'm not sure how those working in the field will welcome the prospect of another wholesale review of the social security system, as we know how adversely affected people are when they're transferred from one system to another. So it might be good to hear from Labour members what exactly it is they want to put in place. However, it's important to highlight how the Scottish Government is using what powers it does have over social security in bold and positive ways, such as the introduction of the game-changing Scottish child payment for all eligible children under 16 by the end of 2022, benefiting up to 410,000 children, And already the Scottish Government has invested £1.4 billion in the last year to support low-income households, including £1 million to mitigate the most damaging parts of the universal credit.
Come to a close, please, Ms.
However, as the UN rapporteur has said, this is unsustainable. So, presiding officer, the answer is full powers devolved to this Parliament.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Today we're expected to debate one of the most significant, most complex reforms of our country's social security system in a little more than an hour. Universal credit has a long background. It was designed to simplify the welfare system and to make work pay, to address the problems that stop people getting into work and taking on more hours. With record numbers of people in work and wage levels rising, it's contributing to real change. Today's Labour Party motion specifically mentions three areas: the general rollout of universal credit, the benefits cap and the two-child limit. Its party promises to scrap universal credit, replace it and to transition to an entirely new system of income-assessed benefits. Yet the response to these proposals has been damning. The Trussell Trust pointed to further problems, saying that, and I quote, "scrapping universal credit may only result in further upheaval." The Institute for Fiscal Studies was clearer, saying the upheaval will be huge. And the Resolution Foundation commented that now isn't the time for a huge overhaul of our social security system. Perhaps Labour should reflect on how we got here. Despite similar proposals crossing their desks, Labour ministers before 2010 simply didn't have the confidence to propose a significant reform to the benefit system, or even to address some of those perverse disincentives that stop people from moving into work. Then, when many of these proposals that are being condemned today were brought before Parliament in 2015, the Labour Party's response was not to oppose them, to accept the two-child limit on tax credits as they had accepted the benefit cap. The then interim leader, Harriet Harman, called for a reasonable approach, that opposition for opposition's sake wouldn't fly. She had seen the consequences from inside government of when Labour's tax credit system ended up paying billions more than they had ever expected. They acknowledged the consequences of the state simply subsidising low pay. That was responsible. But today their proposals around welfare are just not serious. If Jeremy Corbyn was ever to get into Downing Street, he would face two choices: to disappoint his supporters, or to deliver a reformed social security system which was socially and financially ruinous. I haven't got time, I'm afraid. And the SNP are not immune to the same criticisms. In their independence white paper, they called for, and I quote, more streamlined systems for paying welfare that will keep costs down and which are easy to understand, later proposing a single payment system, one that sounds awfully like universal credit. In 2013, the then First Minister, Alex Salmond, had already acknowledged the potential of a benefit cap, telling the Sunday Post that, and again I quote, "if you have the right cap deployed in the right way, then that is a reasonable thing to have." And despite their party's attacks on sanctions, they backed the conclusions of their own expert working group on welfare, which said, and again I quote, "there is a general acceptance that receiving benefits will inevitably imply some form of conditionality." I simply say this, that where people are claiming benefits as a job seeker, the public do expect them to be doing everything reasonable to find work as a condition of that. Presiding Officer, Labour had the opportunity to oppose many of the measures they criticised today. They did not. Now, under Jeremy Corbyn, their only plan seems to be for yet more upheaval and to push unfunded spending commitments. And the SNP, as usual, we've heard a great deal about what they're against, but when pressed on what they're for, their ideas dry up. They now have wide-ranging social security powers, yet not the willingness to fully use them. The reality is that both parties are sending the signal that they will continue to support uncosted spending on social security. But when practical measures are proposed, as in last year's budget, a budget that injected hundreds of millions extra into universal credit and set an end point for the freeze on benefit uprating, they oppose them. Neither Labour nor the SNP are prepared to build positive change to the welfare system, to tackle costs and to support people into good, quality, well-paying work. Thank you.
All parties have had a wee bit extra time, so if we could tighten up in the 4 minutes, please. Fulton McGregor, followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Labour Party for bringing forward this very important issue that greatly affects people in my constituency. and across Scotland. Let's be in no doubt, universal credit is a policy developed in London that is failing Scotland. There are far too many children already growing up in poverty, and the rollout of this, as well as the other horrendous policies, has had a damaging effect on people in my constituency of Coatbridge and Christen, with huge increases in rent arrears and food parcel deliveries for those who can't make ends meet. Indeed, the Coatbridge Food Bank has often had its supplies depleted to zero, with appeals being made to the public to help. And this is why I get annoyed when Tory members in here stand up and bury their heads in the sand when it comes to the challenges of poverty in our constituencies. Just today, North Lanarkshire Council at their Communities and Housing Committee passed a proposal to implement and administer a universal credit assistance fund to assist council tenants who are falling into arrears due to a built-in waiting time for universal credit. Now, I welcome this policy and applaud the officers as well as the councillors of all parties, particularly Labour and the SNP, who made it happen, but that a council should be forking out £1 million to mitigate this horrendous policy on top of what the Scottish Government is already doing is a scandal. And this Scottish Government have been mitigating. In the last year alone, the Government invested almost £1.5 billion to support low-income households. A sizable proportion of this money is used to reverse some of the abhorrent Tory policies dictated to us from Westminster. And a UN expert on poverty has stated, and I know it's been quoted in here many times before, it's outrageous that devolved administrations need to spend resources to shield people from government policies. The main issue I have with Labour's motion that I can't understand is why they're not taking the opportunity to call for the full devolution of welfare powers. As I said earlier in an intervention, Richard Leonard, put aside our differences in independence, surely we can agree that we don't want any chance at all that these crucial powers could be in the hands of Tories and not the Scottish people. Presiding officer, well, Daniel Johnson's shouting from a sedentary position we should vote Labour. It doesn't matter if it's a Labour government this time or a coalition government. If there's a chance it can be a Tory government, we should be getting the powers here. Presiding officer, I want to speak about a more local level. This Friday I'll be hosting the first of 3 networking events which will bring local people and organisations together to discuss how we can tackle inequality and poverty in Coatbridge and Christen. Since being elected in 2016, I've been in awe at the work of individuals and volunteers from local charity and voluntary organisations across my constituency who work day in and day out to help improve the lives of others. They work in the hope that one day they will not need to do so. They work in conjunction with some fantastic local government initiatives such as Club 365 and in tandem with Scottish Government policies such as the Pupil Equity Fund aimed at reducing the education attainment gap with funding given straight to the hands of head teachers. Some of these local organisations I've supported since their inception, such as Cool School Uniforms, Baby Loss Retreat and the Shining Stars. And they join many other individuals and organisations, far too many to name, like Coatbridge Food Bank, the CAB, the Soup Kitchen, the Safety Zone, churches and affiliated organisations who are all supporting our most vulnerable friends and neighbours. As an MSP, I care passionately about my area and I want to do what small bit I can to reduce the inequality that exists. And I hope that this event will allow these and many more local organisations to come together with national charities and local authority services to share what works and discuss how we can all work together to challenge inequality and shape a local response to the plight of poverty that has been forced on us. Presiding officer, I'll finish by saying it's time to take these powers into our own hands, and I'll be supporting the government amendment and urge the whole chamber to do likewise.
Rhoda Grant, followed by Alistair Allen.
Officer, I remember the day when we had a welfare state where people paid in with their taxes and rightly received a safety net when things went wrong. When they were ill or out of work, the state stepped in and helped them get back on their feet. Claiming benefits has never been pleasant. People always need to prove entitlement and always face questions at a time when they're least able to face them, but that's how the system works. One of my first jobs was working with unemployed people and administering schemes to get people into work. I saw firsthand these people as they turned up on day one. They were downtrodden with no spark of life, deeply depressed. The health impact of unemployment on its own is equivalent to smoking 200 cigarettes a day, and that figure comes from a time before universal credit. How much worse is it now? The same people, when they found work, were absolutely unrecognisable. On a number of occasions, they came back after they'd found work, perhaps to hand something back or simply speak to their project worker, and on many occasions I did not recognise them. They were alive again. They had a spark and a spring in their steps. Getting a job was transformational. That was some decades back, when we did have a safety net. I can only imagine the impact on people now, and I wonder how they can ever pick themselves up under this draconian system. That experience was formative and shaped my politics. Presiding officer, women bear the brunt of universal credit because of their caring responsibilities and inherent disadvantage they face through the gender pay gap. They are twice as likely to depend on social security than men are. The current system doubles down on this by targeting women with things like the two-child cap and the rape clause. Women make up 74% of those claiming carers allowance. Almost half of lone parents are living in poverty, and they are predominantly women. We all know that a child's life chances, their education, their wealth, are directly related to their mother's wealth and education. And we're failing these children as well as their mothers with this Dickensian system. These children are all our futures. They are the scientists, doctors and nurses of the future. We fail ourselves if we fail them. As a young person, I never saw food banks. Yes, there was poverty, but not on the scale we see today. We're beginning to see poverty impact on health again. The return of diseases like rickets, which we thought would never be seen in a rich country again. We have huge wealth, but far too many of our population have livelihoods that have more in common with developing countries, and it is totally wrong. They are caught between two governments who do not care. The heartless Tories who only care about accruing more wealth to themselves at the expense of the most vulnerable in our society. And the SNP who pretend to be socialist but stand aside and do nothing to help because that would let the Tories off the hook. They also see this injustice as one of the biggest recruiting sergeants for their only goal, that of independence. What they do not tell the people is that independence would make this situation a whole lot worse. Their own Growth Commission report...
Ms Grant's just closing.
Their own Growth Commission report said that it would be 10 years more of brutal austerity in an independent Scotland. And you can bet that's the best gloss they could put on it. 10 more years of hunger, poverty and failing services. The people in our communities, and there are people in our communities that would not survive that. Presiding officer, the Scottish Labour Party puts people above self-interest, put fairness above amassing riches, and will bring about real change.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There are many things in Labour's motion today with which, despite some of the last contribution, most people in the Parliament, the Tories accepted no doubt, are all likely to agree. As other members have set out, the Tories' implementation of universal credit has had a disastrous human impact on many, many families in Scotland. As most MSPs will in fact know from their own inboxes, the Parliament Social Security Committee has heard enough evidence on that over the last year to convince all but the most hardened of hearts. A system which in some cases sanctions people for not being in highly enough paid jobs has to have something wrong with it. And while we want to move people to digital solutions wherever possible, we have had repeated evidence brought to us as a committee from communities around the country that universal credit's digital-first approach is often leaving behind many vulnerable people who feel wholly unprepared for the task of explaining the multiple problems in their lives to a website, however sophisticated it may be. From the five-week wait to numerous administrative difficulties to the appalling rape clause, universal credit has adversely affected families with children and many of our other most vulnerable citizens. But don't just take my word for it. As others have alluded to, Professor Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, following his visit to the UK, memorably and shockingly had this to say: "Through it all, one actor has stubbornly resisted seeing the situation for what it is, The UK Government has remained determinedly in a state of denial, even while devolved authorities in Scotland and Northern Ireland are frantically trying to devise ways to mitigate, or in other words, to counteract at least the worst features of the UK Government's benefits policy. UK ministers insisted to me that all is well and running according to plan. Well, clearly all is not well or running according to plan, unless the plan was to increase emergency food parcel handouts by 23% in the course of the last 12 months, or to cause substantial increase in rent arrears, according to COSLA. While the Scottish Government has made major efforts to mitigate all this, Professor Alston himself points out that it is neither acceptable nor even ultimately feasible or possible for Holyrood to be using its own resources to clean up an ever wider oil slick of UK policy failure in reserved areas. Presiding Officer, as I said, there is much that I agree on with my Labour colleagues, even if their motion offers little by way of solution. The motion suggests that their plan is for Westminster to roll out an unspecified new system before universal credit is itself fully rolled out. And that, as other members have mentioned, could create a two-tier system, creating more confusion and anxiety for recipients. Instead, Presiding Officer, we should be fixing the things that are wrong here in Scotland. But that, of course, means mentioning a subject that Labour doesn't want mentioned in polite company: the powers of this Parliament. Labour knows fine well that the Scottish Government does not presently have the powers to change the abhorrent two-child limit policy or anything else about universal credit or child tax credits, while the relevant powers remain reserved to Westminster. And as ever, the tragedy of Scottish Labour is their misplaced faith in Westminster to put all this right at some unspecified point in the future. It's time for Labour finally to join the widening consensus that all aspects of the benefits system should be in Scotland's hands, not in Boris Johnson's.
We now move to the closing speeches, and I call Jeremy Balfour for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I have to say I found this afternoon's short debate slightly disappointing. I was surprised initially that this particular subject was brought forward. I think it shows a slight lack of imagination by the Labour Party that we are a devolved Parliament and we're debating something that is reserved to Westminster. But I suppose it maybe just sums up where the Labour Party are in regard to policies in Scotland. We have none. I think the second disappointing factor in regard to this particular debate is that we are simply ignoring the facts and the information that has been gathered by the Social Security Committee and by others. And as Michelle Ballantyne pointed out, that the figures show us that between 80 and 85% of people who are on universal credit today, at the moment, are satisfied with what they are getting in regard to their service. And if we are going to have a debate, let's have a debate of how we improve it for the 16%, but let's not bring down the others who have benefited from universal credit. And can I take one example that I don't think anyone in the chamber has picked up so far, Deputy Presiding Officer? One of the big advantages of universal credit, particularly those who have disabilities, is that under the old system, you had to make 6 applications to 6 different departments and filled out 6 different forms. And for many parents who had disabled children, that became a bureaucracy that was a minefield. The advantage of universal credit is that you are able to make 1 application rather than 6 and have it dealt with in one way. And I think that point should not be missed in regard to the debate that we've had. I have to say, I do slightly laugh at Fulton McGuire, not as him individually, but in regard to the comments that he makes about wanting these powers to, into the Scottish Parliament completely. Every time we get a power, we just give it back to the DWP. And I think if we had that power devolved, it would probably be 2040, 2050, or maybe 2080, so I don't have time to have that. And I just think this talking about let's have all the powers, well, we have the powers at the moment in regard to PIP, in regard to that, but we're simply asking DWP to continue to do it all for us. I think what the UK government has done is listened to those who it hasn't worked for and have amended the system in such a way that they have brought more people in. And I think simply to rip it up and to start again would be a disaster. Not a disaster, as Jamie Harker-Johnson pointed out, not a disaster that we think, but actually many of the third sector have commented on. You know, we've heard that the Trussell Trust, other organisations, do not want it to go away. I would be interested if the Labour Party would tell us if they are going to do what they have suggested, and I accept that Mr Gray did give an outline of what they would do, how much would that cost on day one, and how much would that cost in the first financial year for the UK? Can you give us a figure, or is it simply a pipe dream that is uncosted? Finally, President Officer, because time is going, I think we have to again be careful about the language that we use. Alistair Allen talked about sanctions. But if you look at the figures of the percentage of people who have been sanctioned in the United Kingdom, it is roughly, in fact, exactly the same number that was sanctioned under the legacy benefits. Keith Brown, when he was a minister, that well-known supporter of the Conservative Party, said universal credit has merits, and it does have merits. It is working for the overwhelming majority of people here in Scotland and the United Kingdom. Yes, it needs tweaking and changes. That's what the UK government has done it. I would suggest we get behind it and support it rather than talking down people who are benefiting from this benefit. Thank you.
Shirley-Ann Somerville. 4 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is clear that the vast majority of members in the Chamber at least agree that universal credit is a failure. It has, and many people have spoken about specific examples, talked about how it's brought people further into poverty, the anxiety and the rent arrears that often goes with that. Now, the Scottish Government has been at the forefront of highlighting where the UK government welfare policies are hurting people, and that particularly includes those that are disproportionately affecting women, children and disabled people. Just as we've been at the forefront of pointing out the flaws in universal credit and calling for it to be halted where those clear flaws have been fixed. Against a backdrop of social security spending in Scotland being cut by £3.7 billion by 2021, the Scottish Government has invested over £1.4 billion to support low-income households, including £100 million to mitigate the worst impacts of the UK government welfare reforms. However, as the UN Rapporteur, Professor Philip Alston, who has been regularly quoted again this afternoon, has said, mitigation comes at a price and it is not sustainable for devolved administrations to spend resources to fix the UK government policies. Now, we've heard from a number of... Certainly.
Ian Gray.
Surely, if a benefit is devolved and is then improved and made more generous, those resources will have to be found within the Scottish Government's resources. That would always be the case, wouldn't it?
Shirley-Ann Somerville.
Well, we will make sure and endeavour at every single budget that we are doing our best within the block grant that we've had. And what I can't remember, because it hasn't happened, is the Scottish Labour Party coming forward at any budget with any specific proposals to actually improve welfare. It's all about the headlines and very little, in fact nothing, about the substance that goes behind that. Because what we heard, I think we've heard enough from you, Mr Gray, what we've heard from Mr Gray today was details of what they might like to change around universal credit, but we haven't actually heard anything about the new benefit that they would like to replace it with, particularly how long it would take to be designed, introduced and fully implemented. And yes, we can talk about the role of the Scottish Government and what we can do with that, but there is a responsibility on the opposition parties to actually demonstrate what they would like to do differently and how that should be paid for. Because what we have set out is safe and secure transition for the benefits that we will be taking. We're working with stakeholders to ensure that that timetable is relevant to what they're doing. And I was exceptionally disappointed when Richard Leonard opened this debate to hear him criticise the alterations that we made in June, because that allows us to bring in the Scottish Child Payment. And it is desperately disappointing if we're at the stage that the Scottish Labour Party have actually criticised this government for using the powers that we have to ensure that we are delivering on our ambition to tackle child poverty. That was something I thought we could have and should be coming together on. Presiding Officer, we've heard a lot today, and quite rightly, about the UK Government making some changes to address the flaws of universal credit. I think it's only fair to point out, frankly, they are absolutely inadequate. Reducing a waiting period for a first payment from 6 weeks to 5 is not helping the people I see in my surgeries, or I'm sure for other members across the chamber. The fact that people have to pay their advance payments back from their universal credit, thus running them into further debt, is not helping the people that we are here to serve. That's why it is time for the UK Government to take responsibility, but the best, the real and the only solution is for the UK Government to devolve all the social security powers to this Government so we can put dignity, fairness and respect right at the heart of the system here in Scotland.
Call Mark Griffin to close the debate for 5 minutes, please, Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate about scrapping once and for all the cruel benefit cap, the hated two-child limit and universal credit, themselves a set of welfare reforms that are having a catastrophic impact on women, children and the communities we represent, has been a vital one ahead of next month's election. Across Scotland, families have the daily agony of having to keep on top of a universal credit claim, figuring out how to pay the rent because a family cap or a benefit cap has decided they aren't allowed what they need for no other reason other than cruel Tory austerity. Members have spoken about the devastating 5-week wait. I wholeheartedly agree with them, and I'm proud that Labour will commit in its manifesto this week to an interim payment before universal credit is scrapped. The abolition of the two-child limit, the rape clause, the benefit sanction regime and the bedroom tax, it will also be in our fully costed manifesto this week, amongst the other immediate changes set out by Ian Gray. To get by and raise their children, everyone spoke about the very real challenges constituents are facing every day. Everyone, that is, except the Tories, who blindly ignored the people who are facing poverty, rent arrears and destitution because of this despicable system. And we've all heard about the problems reported, as well as the more complex and obscure, even vindictive changes that universal credit has brought in. Tax rebates from previous years swallowed up. Students amassing huge arrears because the DWP doesn't process their information. And the proliferation of debts to the DWP, which amount to over £15 million in my region alone. Presiding Officer, these welfare reforms are affecting people just trying to live their life. And many in the chamber will know I've reflected on my own family's circumstances amidst the damaging Tory welfare reforms. I was one of 4 children. My parents worked hard. My dad is a welder, my mum is a bank clerk, to support the family they chose to have. When my dad was diagnosed with a serious heart condition at the age of 37, he became unable to carry on doing the job he'd done for 20 years. My parents didn't plan for that situation. Who does plan for that situation when they start a family? But, Presiding Officer, what today has shown is what each party will do to help. We don't need reminded of what the Tories offer. The proclamations from the benches opposite that poor people shouldn't be allowed to have too many children, that the rich shouldn't have to make a contribution to those in need, has told the Chamber enough in similar debates. The devastation is already eaten away at our communities. But they say we should be thankful. They say we should be thankful because 200,000 more children in poverty across the UK because of the benefits freeze will see a paltry 1.7% increase in their parents' benefits. We should be thankful that the extension of the two-child limit on universal credit for children born before April 2017 won't roll out. And amazingly, just days after Willie Rennie offered a half-hearted apology for the bedroom tax, the Lib Dem amendment proposed holding on to the system that they helped usher in hand with the Tories. In the face of catastrophic poverty it has caused and heartbreaking testimony, they continue to support it, save for a few tweaks. But the SNP position here is the strangest, I think. It's confusion, confusion, confusion. Today the Cabinet Secretary says she's happy to scrap it, but MSPs in the back benches say change is too difficult. Last night the SNP group were briefed that we should stick with it and tinker with it until we worked, in a helpful briefing that was issued to all MSPs researchers. But no, well, I'll forward the briefing that your researcher sent to the whole Parliament. I'll forward that briefing to you, Cabinet Secretary, that I'm sure your backbenchers have relied on heavily.
We've read it.
We've all read it. But let's not forget, last week the First Minister outlined a different choice. Another independence referendum or more of the same from another Tory government. A choice that leaves 9,000 families stuck with a two-child limit and 200,000 households languishing on universal credit as little more than collateral damage. When it will take the SNP a decade to deliver all of the benefits already devolved, how can they expect families to wait for independence and maybe an amended version of universal credit another 10, 15, 20 years down the line?
Mr Griffin's just closing.
Presiding Officer, these families need real change and they need it right now. That's what a Labour government will deliver. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
That concludes the debate on universal credit, and it's time to move on to the next item of business. If members could shift their seats fairly quickly, please.